Hello friends, Chris here with ISK Recording. Welcome to Lesson 20, the source. This is important to know because you need to be able to recognize a good source from a bad source when you're in a recording situation. Because if you got a bad source, there's not really anything you can do to fix it. Your goal as the recording engineer is to capture that source in whatever misery or glory it is. You need to be able to recognize the difference between a good sounding source and a bad sounding source. And that might seem like a no-brainer, but we're going to talk about some of the differences and how they affect your recordings. Because you want your recordings to sound good, right? So it all starts with a source. A good quality instrument will have a nice pleasant tone, and a talented musician will be able to play consistently and not make mistakes. And the end product, the final recording, it creates an emotional impact in the listener. And people are going to judge the quality of your work based on that emotional impact. So if the artist is making a lot of mistakes or the guitar is out of tune or something, the listener isn't going to justify it as like, oh well, that wasn't really the recording engineer's fault. No, the listener is just not going to have that emotional impact that makes him feel like, oh, this song is awesome. Oh, the work that studio does is awesome. So you need to get everything right. Even if it's not your fault or it's borderline out of your control, you need to be able to recognize the situations that sound good or don't sound good so that you can remedy it if it doesn't sound good and make it sound good. Because ultimately, it's on you. And as a recording engineer, you want to have the reputation that makes anybody and everybody sound good. There's a bit of a saying in the industry, you can't polish a turd. So if you're recording a guitar that just doesn't have good tone and you think, oh, I can spice it up with my tone generator plugin, it's not going to be the same. And if you're recording an electric guitar and you have a tube amp sitting right there, but you're being lazy and you just want to use the tube amp effects plugin, it's just not going to sound as good. Capture the best sounding source that you can. Don't try to fix it later with EQ or effects. Oh, that vocal sucks, but I could just put tons of reverb on it. No, capture it as good as possible. So when an artist comes into your studio and they bring their own guitar, and it's just like a cheap, thrashy, tinny sounding glorified canoe paddle, and you can't stand the tone of it, well, what do? And that raises the need for having a small arsenal of instruments on hand in your studio that artists can use whenever they want. But if you're going to invest in studio instruments, you have to invest in really good quality studio instruments. Otherwise, that defeats the purpose. In my studio, I've got a couple of really nice sounding tube amps. So like sometimes clients come into the studio and their song has heavy distortion and they bring their solid state amp. And you know what? Solid state just doesn't do distortion the same way as tubes do. Sorry for all you solid state lovers. I know I might get bashed for this, but nothing does distortion like tubes do distortion. Not a solid state amp, not an amp emulator, and not an amp emulation plugin. There's nothing that exists that distorts as nicely as an actual tube. So what's the difference between a bad sounding instrument and a good sounding instrument? Well, let's take a drum kit for instance. A bad sounding drum kit might have sloppy heads on it and it'll just be kind of loose and dull sounding. As opposed to a good sounding drum kit, which is tuned nicely, has nice wood, it'll resonate. The various parts of the drum kit, such as the snare, the toms, the cymbals, each individual part will have its own unique tone and the kit will resonate in a way that's musical. Now with a guitar, they're designed so that the guitar body amplifies the sound, but some guitars use bracing inside that deadens that amplification, or the strings might be too far away from the body, or it might be poor quality strings. A bad sounding guitar will sound thrashy and tinny, it'll just be harsh. Whereas a good sounding guitar will be warm and smooth. You'll hear that body vibrating and resonating, and it just creates this warm, beautiful sound. With electric guitars and bass guitars, their sound is picked up by what's called the pickups. Go figure. It's a little electromagnetic coil that sits just behind the strings, and when the string vibrates, it induces a current into that coil. Some pickups are more sensitive than others, some are sloppy, some have a higher output than others, and some have a little bit of distortion, usually intentionally, such as EMG pickups. They add a little bit of distortion, and it's nice and pleasant. And then there's active pickups as well, which have a stronger output and require a battery, and a lot of guitars just use simple passive humbucker pickups. And then from the pickup, it goes down the guitar cord and into the amp. Now, I just talked about amps a couple minutes ago, but I'll say it again because there's a big difference between a good quality amp and a low quality amp. And if you do buy an amp for your studio, I strongly suggest you get a tube amp. And the amp feeds the speaker, which sits inside a cabinet. Some speakers are better than others, some produce different tones. Also the cabinet, it could be open back or closed back. Now generally speaking, and this applies to pretty much all instruments, a better quality instrument will have richer harmonics and it'll generate the notes that are being played with more precision and with a nicer tone. And they'll also produce less noise. For instance, a trumpet, I'm a trumpet player, but a trumpet makes noise when you press the valves up and down. Some trumpets make more valve noise than others. Drums are quite noisy, like the snare underneath. When you're playing the toms, that snare will rattle. Guitars are known for making fret noise as you move your hand up and down the neck. So certain instruments make more noise than others, and that's just part of the instrument itself. But generally, it's more ideal to have an instrument that makes less noise and more music. So, in conclusion, get your recordings right at the source. If your source doesn't sound good, do everything you can to make it sound good. And this is lesson 20 in the full structured audio engineering course that I'm putting here on YouTube. So hit subscribe and you'll get the entire course for free. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.